It was a bright, sunny afternoon at the bustling airport. Travelers rushed through terminals, clutching boarding passes, luggage trailing behind them. Among them was Marcus Hayes, a middle-aged black man with a warm smile and an air of quiet confidence. Marcus wasn't dressed in flashy clothes or designer labels, but his tailored suit and polished shoes spoke volumes about his success. He approached the counter for first-class check-in, greeted the staff with polite words, and handed over his ticket. Standing nearby was Richard Calloway, a well-dressed businessman in his late 40s, his wrist adorned with an expensive watch, and his demeanor radiating entitlement. Richard had noticed Marcus from the moment he walked in, and something about the man's calm self-assurance rubbed him the wrong way. He couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "Must be an upgrade. Can't imagine how someone like him can afford first class." As the flight was called for boarding, Marcus walked toward the gate, his ticket in hand. Richard trailed closely, eyeing Marcus with thinly veiled disdain. When they reached the first-class cabin, Marcus settled into his seat by the window. Richard stopped dead in his tracks when he realized the seat next to Marcus was his. "Are you sure this is correct?" Richard snapped at the flight attendant, pointing at his boarding pass and then at Marcus. "I thought first-class seats were supposed to ensure a certain level of exclusivity." The attendant's smile faltered, but she maintained her professionalism. "Yes, sir, this is your assigned seat." Richard sighed dramatically, muttering loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Unbelievable. They'll let just anyone in here these days." Marcus glanced at him but chose not to respond. Instead, he pulled out a book from his carry-on, a thick hardcover with a striking title about leadership and innovation. Richard scoffed again. "Right, like he's actually going to read that," he thought to himself, settling into his seat with a huff. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Richard couldn't resist making passive-aggressive comments. "First class used to mean class," he said, staring straight ahead but clearly addressing Marcus. "Now it's just a free-for-all." Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Richard hesitated, then shrugged. "No, nothing at all. I'm just expressing how standards seem to be slipping everywhere these days." The tension in the cabin was palpable, and a few other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus took a deep breath, choosing once again not to escalate the situation. But then the unexpected happened. A member of the flight crew approached Marcus with a smile. "Mr. Hayes, the captain would like to extend a personal greeting and thank you for flying with us today." Richard's head snapped toward Marcus, his jaw tightening. "What's this about?" he demanded, looking at the attendant. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing at Marcus. But before she could respond, Marcus gently interjected. "It's nothing out of the ordinary. I've worked with the airline in the past on some consulting projects." "Consulting projects?" Richard repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Let me guess, you're some kind of motivational speaker or something." Marcus smiled faintly but didn't reply. The flight attendant excused herself, and the cabin settled into an uneasy silence. Richard couldn't help himself. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know, people like you always try to act like you belong, but money can't buy class." Marcus placed his book down, his expression unreadable. "And what does class mean to you?" he asked simply. Richard opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by the flight attendant returning with a tray. She placed it in front of Marcus, a specially prepared meal, accompanied by a handwritten note. Richard craned his neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the note, but Marcus casually folded it and tucked it into his pocket. The moment passed, but Richard's curiosity only grew. Who was this man, and why did he seem so unfazed by the insults? As the flight continued, Richard began to notice subtle details. The respectful nods from the crew, the way Marcus carried himself, and the quiet authority in his demeanor. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Richard couldn't hold back anymore. He leaned in again, his voice sharper this time. "What exactly do you do, Mr. Hayes?" Marcus said, extending a hand. "Marcus Hayes, and what I do isn't nearly as important as how I treat people." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Richard looked uncertain. He hadn't expected such a direct, poised response. Yet Marcus's calm demeanor only deepened Richard's irritation and curiosity. What Richard didn't know, what no one on that flight could have guessed, was that Marcus Hayes was far more than he appeared. The truth about who he was and what he'd accomplished would soon come to light, and when it did, it would leave Richard speechless. Richard leaned back in his seat, his mind racing as he tried to piece together who Marcus Hayes really was. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. The calm confidence, the respectful treatment from the crew, the special meal, none of it fit the image Richard had quickly formed in his mind. The flight attendant passed by again, and Richard flagged her down. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "What's the deal with Mr. Hayes over there?" The attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't share personal information about any of our passengers." Richard frowned but waved her off dismissively. He glanced at Marcus, who had returned to his book, seemingly unbothered by the world around him. Every now and then, Marcus would pause to jot something down in a small leather notebook. Richard squinted, trying to see what he was writing, but the angle made it impossible. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, advising everyone to buckle up. Richard tightened his seatbelt and stole another glance at Marcus. The man didn't even flinch, calmly closing his book and tucking it away. "You're awfully composed," Richard said, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. "Turbulence doesn't bother you." Marcus turned to him with a faint smile. "I've learned to focus on what I can control. Worrying about the rest doesn't help much." Richard rolled his eyes. "That sounds like something out of a self-help seminar. Let me guess, you're some kind of life coach." Marcus chuckled softly. "Not exactly." The vague response only fueled Richard's frustration. He wasn't used to people sidestepping his questions, and he certainly wasn't used to being out of the loop. The flight attendant returned, offering drinks to the passengers. Marcus requested a sparkling water, while Richard opted for a scotch, hoping it would calm his nerves. As he sipped his drink, he kept stealing glances at Marcus, who seemed utterly unbothered by the scrutiny. Richard finally broke the silence. "So, Mr. Hayes, you said you've worked with the airline. What kind of consulting do you do?" Marcus turned to him, his expression polite but guarded. "I've worked in leadership development and organizational strategy." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Leadership development? So you tell people how to run their companies?" "Something like that," Marcus replied, his tone measured. Richard smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Well, I hope they pay you well for all that advice." Marcus didn't respond immediately, letting the comment hang in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "What I do isn't just about advice. It's about creating systems that empower people to succeed. It's about finding solutions to complex problems and helping organizations reach their potential." Richard stared at him, momentarily taken aback by the eloquence of the response, but he quickly recovered, brushing it off with a scoff. "Sounds like a lot of buzzwords to me." Marcus smiled faintly but didn't take the bait. Instead, he reached for his notebook again, jotting down a few more notes. Richard couldn't help himself. "What are you writing?" Marcus closed the notebook and placed it in his lap. "Just some thoughts for a project I'm working on." Richard leaned back, his curiosity now fully piqued. Must be some project to have the captain sending personal greetings. Marcus didn't respond, and the silence stretched between them. As the flight continued, Richard found himself growing more agitated. He was used to being the most important person in the room, or in this case, the cabin. But Marcus's calm demeanor and the respect he commanded from the crew were throwing him off balance. At one point, Marcus stood to stretch his legs, walking toward the galley at the front of the plane. Richard watched him go, noting the confident stride and the way the flight attendants greeted him with warm smiles. When Marcus returned, he noticed Richard's eyes on him and offered a polite nod before resuming his seat. Richard couldn't hold back any longer. "All right, Mr. Hayes, you got me curious. Who are you really? Because I've got a feeling there's more to your story than you're letting on." Marcus looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Why does it matter who I am?" Richard hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I like to know who I'm dealing with." Marcus leaned back in his seat, studying Richard for a moment. "And what would you do with that information?" The question hung in the air, and Richard realized he didn't have a good answer. He shrugged, trying to play it off, just making conversation. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Sometimes it's better to let people reveal themselves in their own time. The response only deepened the mystery, and Richard found himself more frustrated than ever. He drained the rest of his scotch and signaled for another, trying to shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something important. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Richard couldn't stop glancing at Marcus, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? What was his story? And why did he seem so unfazed by the subtle, and not so subtle, insults Richard had been throwing his way? The answers were coming, but not in the way Richard expected. What lay ahead would not only reveal the truth about Marcus Hayes, but also force Richard to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. As the plane landed smoothly on the runway and taxied toward the gate, the usual flurry of activity began in the first-class cabin. Passengers gathered their belongings, stretching and adjusting themselves after the long flight. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for his carry-on bag, his movements calm and deliberate. Richard, still seated, couldn't help but watch him, his curiosity now mixed with a strange sense of unease. The flight attendant returned with a final smile for Marcus. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Hayes. We hope to see you again soon." Marcus nodded politely. "Thank you for the excellent service." Richard, who had been observing the exchange, couldn't hold back any longer. As Marcus stepped into the aisle, Richard stood and followed closely behind. "Wait a second," he said, his voice low but insistent. Marcus paused, turning slightly to face him. "Yes." Richard hesitated, suddenly aware of how intrusive his curiosity might seem, but he pushed forward anyway. "I just want to know, what is it that makes you so important?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Important? That's not a word I'd use to describe myself." Richard frowned, frustrated by the elusive response. "Come on, don't play coy. The special treatment, the respect from the staff, it's obvious you're somebody. So who are you?" Marcus studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I'm just someone who believes in treating people with kindness and respect. Everything else is secondary." With that, Marcus turned and began walking toward the exit. Richard stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to follow or let the mystery go. But something inside him wouldn't let it rest. He grabbed his briefcase and hurried after Marcus, catching up with him in the terminal. The airport was bustling with travelers, but Marcus moved through the crowd with the same quiet confidence he'd shown throughout the flight. Richard finally caught up to him near the baggage claim. "Look," Richard said, his tone softer now, "I'm not trying to pry or anything. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to you than meets the eye." Marcus turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Why does it matter to you?" Richard hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'm just curious. Or maybe it's because you seem so different from what I expected." Marcus' lips curved into a faint smile. "And what did you expect?" Richard opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. He wasn't sure how to articulate the assumptions he'd made. Assumptions he was starting to realize might say more about him than about Marcus. Before he could figure out what to say, a voice called out from across the terminal. "Mr. Hayes." Both men turned to see a well-dressed man in a sharp suit approaching. The man greeted Marcus with a warm handshake and a respectful nod. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person. The car is waiting to take you to the conference." Richard's eyes widened as he took in the interaction. "Conference," he repeated, unable to hide his surprise. Marcus glanced at him, his expression calm. "I'm speaking at an event this evening." The man in the suit turned to Richard with a polite smile. "Mr. Hayes is one of the keynote speakers at the Global Leadership Summit. He's been instrumental in reshaping organizational strategies for some of the world's most successful companies." Richard blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. He turned back to Marcus, his mind racing. "You're a keynote speaker?" Marcus nodded, his expression modest. "Among other things." Richard felt a rush of emotions, shock, embarrassment, and a strange sense of awe. He thought back to the flight, to all the assumptions he'd made, to the comments he'd muttered under his breath. The man in the suit gestured toward the exit. "We should get going, Mr. Hayes. The schedule is tight." Marcus nodded but hesitated, turning back to Richard. "You know what he said, his tone thoughtful. It's never too late to see people for who they really are, not who you think they should be." With that, Marcus extended a hand. Richard stared at it for a moment before shaking it, his grip firm, but his mind still reeling. As Marcus walked away, flanked by his escort, Richard stood in the middle of the bustling terminal, his thoughts a whirlwind. For the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of self-reflection, a realization that his assumptions and judgments had blinded him to the truth. But even as he stood there, trying to process everything, a nagging question lingered in the back of his mind. Who was Marcus Hayes, really? And why did his words feel like they carried more weight than mere politeness? The answers were still out there, waiting to be uncovered, and Richard couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Marcus was just the beginning of a much larger story. Richard stood in the terminal for what felt like an eternity, watching Marcus and the suited man disappear into the crowd. His mind wouldn't stop replaying their conversation, the subtle confidence in Marcus's words, and the sharp contrast between his own assumptions and the reality he'd just learned. A keynote speaker at a global summit, reshaping some of the world's top companies, it was almost too much to process. He realized, almost begrudgingly, that Marcus had been right. Richard's snap judgments had painted an incomplete picture, one shaped by bias, pride, and his own insecurities. For someone who prided himself on being well-informed and sharp, this misstep stung deeply. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to Marcus's story, something he hadn't yet seen. As Richard retrieved his luggage and made his way toward the airport exit, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was his assistant, Susan, calling to confirm the details of his business meeting later that evening. He answered distractedly, his thoughts still consumed by Marcus. "Everything is set for the board dinner," Susan said brightly. "It's at the Grand Empress Hotel at 7 p.m. I sent all the details to your email." Richard barely registered her words. "Thanks, Susan," he replied absently before hanging up. The Grand Empress. That was one of the most exclusive venues in the city, a place where only the elite gathered. He wondered if Marcus would be staying there or perhaps speaking at the same venue. The thought sent a strange mix of curiosity and unease through him. By the time Richard arrived at his hotel, the city was bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. He checked into his suite, but instead of relaxing or preparing for his own meeting, he found himself searching online for information about the Global Leadership Summit. A quick search revealed that it was indeed being held at the Grand Empress, with high-profile leaders, CEOs, and innovators from around the world in attendance. Scrolling through the list of keynote speakers, Richard's eyes landed on Marcus's name. Marcus Hayes, leadership strategist and author. The short biography accompanying his photo described him as a leading voice in organizational change, with a reputation for bridging cultural and corporate divides. It also mentioned that he had founded a nonprofit focused on education and empowerment in underserved communities, and that he was a strong advocate for diversity in leadership. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The more he read, the more he realized just how far off the mark his assumptions had been. Marcus wasn't just accomplished, he was extraordinary. And yet, on the plane, he had shown none of the arrogance or superiority that Richard might have expected from someone of his caliber. Instead, Marcus had been calm, composed, and unshakably kind, even in the face of Richard's dismissive attitude. The evening crept closer, and Richard reluctantly got ready for his dinner meeting. As he arrived at the Grand Empress, the opulence of the venue was almost overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the air buzzed with the hum of power and wealth. Richard's colleagues greeted him warmly, but he found it hard to focus on the conversations around him. His mind kept drifting back to Marcus. As the dinner progressed, Richard's curiosity grew unbearable. He excused himself and wandered into the main ballroom, where the summit's keynote speeches were taking place. The room was packed, the audience hanging on every word of the current speaker. Richard scanned the stage but didn't see Marcus. Still, the energy in the room was palpable, and Richard couldn't help but be drawn in. Just as he was about to leave, the lights dimmed slightly, and an announcer's voice filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next keynote speaker, a visionary leader and advocate for change, Mr. Marcus Hayes." The room erupted in applause as Marcus stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding yet unassuming. Richard froze, his heart pounding as he watched Marcus take the microphone. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that demanded attention without arrogance. Marcus began to speak, his voice steady and clear. He talked about the power of empathy in leadership, the importance of challenging assumptions, and the need to see people for who they truly are, not who we expect them to be. His words were powerful, cutting through the noise of corporate jargon and reaching straight to the heart of the audience. Richard found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word. It was as if Marcus was speaking directly to him, addressing the very flaws Richard had been forced to confront in himself. The room seemed to fade away, and all Richard could think about was how wrong he had been, and how much he still had to learn. As Marcus' speech reached its crescendo, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Richard's mind raced with questions, his emotions a whirlwind of awe, regret, and a strange, newfound respect. He couldn't deny it any longer. Marcus Hayes was everything Richard had never expected, and more. But what Marcus would say next, and how their paths might cross again, remained to be seen.